The house was quiet, the evening air heavy with silence, when the first low growl of motorcycle engines broke through the calm, echoing down the street like a storm coming closer. The wife, who had been reading on the living room couch, froze at the sound. She knew the HOA had been hostile for weeks, sending letters and threats about supposed violations that made no sense, but she never imagined they would stoop this low. The engines grew louder, rattling the windows, until she rose and stepped to the curtain, peeking outside. A line of rough-looking bikers slowed in front of her driveway, their headlights cutting through the dusk like sharp blades. Their jackets were dark, patched with symbols she did not recognize, and their eyes followed the house with a hunger that made her neighbors duck behind blinds. One by one the bikes cut their engines, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. The wife's breath steadied, her hand brushed against her phone, but she did not dial. Instead, she turned and waited. She did not shake, did not panic, only pressed her lips into a thin line as the heavy knock rattled the door, so loud it made picture frames tremble. The leader's voice followed, deep and rough, shouting threats about HOA rules and heavy fines, demanding her husband pay or leave the neighborhood. His voice dripped with arrogance, certain his presence alone would break her. But when she opened the door a crack and looked out, her face carried no fear. Her eyes locked with his, steady, calm, and unreadable, and that unexpected calm unsettled him for a heartbeat, though he quickly covered it with a sneer. The other bikers stood behind him, laughing, revving engines, showing tattoos and scars like weapons. The wife stood in silence, letting the tension rise. The leader leaned closer, his boots scraping against the porch, his leather vest reeking of smoke and oil. He expected her to beg, to plead for mercy, but instead she tilted her head and said nothing. Her quiet composure spread unease through the men who had come to intimidate. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering, too afraid to step outside. They had seen the HOA's dirty tricks before, fines, threats, even legal battles, but never something like this. Sending a gang of bikers to a family's doorstep was beyond anything they imagined. Still, none dared interfere. The wife finally spoke, her voice calm and steady, telling the men her husband was not home. The leader grinned, thinking he had control. He said it didn't matter, because they weren't here to talk. They were here to send a message. His words carried menace, but her expression didn't change. She looked at him with the same quiet certainty, as though she knew something he didn't, and the silence stretched long enough that even his men shifted uncomfortably. He tried to rattle her further, pounding on the doorframe, raising his voice until the sound carried down the block. But the louder he grew, the calmer she seemed, her stillness like a wall he could not climb. She told him once, with quiet finality, that he should leave. The leader blinked, caught off guard by the confidence in her tone. One of the bikers muttered under his breath, uneasy with how their simple job wasn't unfolding as planned. They had expected screaming, tears, begging. They had expected her to collapse under fear, but instead she stood like a stone, unshaken by their noise. The leader tried to laugh it off, turning back to his men and mocking her calmness, but deep down he felt irritation stirring. Something about this woman's silence, her lack of fear, unnerved him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice to something colder, whispering threats about what would happen if her husband didn't pay. He described broken windows, scratched cars, late-night visits that would leave no rest. His words were poison, designed to plant dread. Yet as his words lingered in the air, her gaze did not waver. She stared at him like he was no more than a shadow at her doorstep. Her calmness was not arrogance, but it carried weight, as if she had already decided the outcome and it was not in his favor. The tension thickened as the other bikers shifted, their smirks fading slightly, because intimidation was only fun when the victim showed fear. Without fear, it became something else, something that reflected their own weakness back at them. The wife quietly reached for her phone, tapping the screen without breaking eye contact. The leader's grin faltered for just a moment, but he forced it back, barking at his men to stand tall, to keep laughing, to keep the image of control. But the neighbors saw the cracks forming. The street, once dominated by the roar of bikes, was now filled with silence broken only by the uneasy shuffle of boots and the slow, steady voice of the wife telling the men they would regret staying longer. Her words landed like stones, heavy and final, and the leader's temper flared. He slammed his fist on the doorframe, swearing loudly, calling her bluff. He said she was nothing, her husband was nothing, and the HOA owned this street, owned every family here. His men cheered to echo his words, but their laughter rang hollow, less certain than before. The wife stood straighter, her voice unshaken as she repeated the same words. You will regret this. She didn't shout, didn't argue, just repeated them with the calmness of someone who knew what was coming. The leader felt a flicker of unease creep through his chest, but he silenced it with bravado, shouting louder to drown it out. He ordered his men to rev their engines, to shake the ground, to remind her who they were. The engines roared, the air filled with fumes, but her steady stare didn't break. One neighbor whispered to another, asking why she looked so calm. The rumor spread quickly from window to window. Maybe she wasn't alone. Maybe her husband had called someone already. Maybe there was more to this family than the HOA knew. The whispers grew, feeding the tension. The wife stayed by the door, her hand still holding the phone, her finger hovering over one number. She hadn't called anyone yet, but the way she stood made it seem like help was already on the way. The leader's sneer wavered. He barked again, louder, more desperate, as if trying to convince himself of his own strength. But the truth was leaking through the cracks. His men looked around nervously, the thrill fading. What had started as an easy job was turning into something different, something unpredictable, and unpredictability was dangerous. The wife let the silence linger once more, then spoke clearly, telling him again that her husband would not be pleased to find them here. Her voice carried an edge now, sharp and undeniable, and for the first time the leader took a step back without meaning to. His men noticed, and the illusion of control slipped. The wife closed the door gently, not with fear but with finality, leaving the gang outside in the growing darkness. The engines roared again, but now the sound seemed forced, desperate, like noise covering unease. The neighbors still watched, whispering, sensing that the gang's power was fading fast. The leader barked an order to his men, telling them to wait, that they would return when the husband was home. But in his gut, he felt something shifting, something dangerous building. He didn't know yet what was coming, but the wife did. She walked back to the couch, sat down with steady hands, and waited. She was not afraid because she knew what her husband was capable of, and the bikers would learn that soon enough. The street was quiet again after the engines died down, but the silence was heavy, filled with whispers hiding behind curtains. Every house along the block had eyes pressed to glass, neighbors too scared to step outside but too curious to look away. They had seen the bikers storm up to the house, had seen the leader pounding the door, shouting threats, and had heard the cold, steady voice of the wife cutting through their noise. The neighbors could not believe she stood there so calm, facing men who could break doors and smash windows without a second thought. One old man in the house across the street muttered to his wife that this was madness. The HOA had finally lost its mind, and his wife nodded, pulling the curtain tighter as though hiding behind thin fabric would keep danger away. Children in another home asked their parents why those men were here, why they were shouting at the lady across the road, and their parents hushed them quickly, telling them to stay away from the windows. Fear ran down the street like water finding cracks, filling every home, every heart, because everyone knew if the HOA could send a gang to her door, then nobody was safe anymore. Yet mixed with the fear was a strange kind of curiosity. They noticed how the wife had not panicked, how she had not begged, how she had not even raised her voice, and it unsettled them. They began whispering to each other over text messages, quick calls made in hushed tones, trading questions. Who was she really? Why was she not afraid? Some swore they saw her smile faintly when the gang leader tried to threaten her. Others said her hand was on her phone the whole time, like she was waiting for the right moment to make a call that would change everything. The neighbors felt trapped in their homes, forced to be witnesses to a story they did not understand but knew was dangerous. One man down the street thought about calling the police, but he quickly shook the thought away. Everyone knew the HOA had influence, had connections, and too many times the police had shown up only to side with them, dismissing complaints as misunderstandings. Nobody wanted to be the one who drew attention to themselves, So they stayed in the shadows and let the scene unfold. But as they watched, unease twisted into something else. The wife's calmness was like a puzzle, and puzzles gnawed at people's minds. The gang stood outside her door, uncertain now, their leader louder but less convincing, their laughter thinner, and the neighbors could sense it. They could feel the balance shifting, though they did not know why. A young boy whispered to his older brother that maybe her husband was someone important, maybe a man the bikers feared, and the brother shushed him but secretly thought the same. The rumor began to take shape even without evidence, spreading from house to house like smoke. Maybe they had chosen the wrong target. Fear was still strong, yes, but now it mixed with expectation, like waiting for a storm to break. Curtains moved again and again as eyes followed the bikers pacing, restless, not as confident as when they arrived. Some neighbors dared to film short clips on their phones, too frightened to upload them but unwilling to lose proof of what they had seen. The HOA had ruled the neighborhood with fines, with letters, with control, but this was different. This was violence brought to their doorstep, and it was unraveling in a way nobody could predict. Whispers turned into silent prayers, because while none of them had the courage to act, all of them felt that something was coming. Something in the wife's quietness, in her calm words, hinted that the bikers' show of power would not end as planned. The neighbors stayed glued to their windows, their fear battling their curiosity, as the night deepened and the suspense thickened. They did not know yet that, in a matter of minutes, everything they thought about the HOA, about their neighbors, and about safety itself would be shaken to its core. The sound of another engine came from a distance, different from the deep rumble of the gang's motorcycles, smoother, faster, controlled, and the neighbors leaned closer to their windows when they realized it was a car turning onto the street. The bikers shifted as the headlights grew nearer, and then the husband's car pulled into the driveway, slowing to a stop in front of the house. He stepped out calmly, carrying no sign of surprise, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp as they swept over the gang blocking his path. The leader of the bikers smirked, thinking this was his moment to finally deliver the message, but the smirk faltered when the husband did not react the way he expected. There was no fear, no confusion, not even anger, just silence and a stare that carried weight. The wife stood by the window inside, watching him with the same calm she had shown earlier, as if she had been waiting for this moment. The husband closed the car door slowly, his every move measured, and walked toward the house with steady steps, not once breaking eye contact with the leader. The bikers laughed, but it was nervous laughter, as though they were trying to convince themselves they were still in control. The husband stopped at the foot of the porch, his shadow stretching long in the dim light, and asked in a low voice what they thought they were doing at his home. His voice was calm but carried steel, and the question itself seemed less like curiosity and more like a warning. The leader tried to bark out threats about the HOA, about fines, about rules that had been broken, but his words sounded weaker now, forced into the silence that surrounded them. The husband listened without moving, and when the leader finished, he simply tilted his head and asked if this was what the HOA had become, sending men like them to knock on doors and shout at women when their husbands were not home. The words cut deeper than a shout ever could, because they stripped away the illusion of strength and exposed the gang for what they were, hired muscle. The neighbors, still watching from the shadows of their homes, felt their hearts race as the scene unfolded. The bikers had arrived with noise and arrogance, but now they seemed smaller in the presence of one man who did not raise his voice, who did not need to prove himself. The leader tried to recover, stepping closer with a sneer, but he faltered when the husband did not flinch. One of the younger bikers muttered to another that something felt wrong, that maybe they should back off, but the leader snapped at him to stay quiet. The husband stepped closer now, his eyes never leaving the leader's, and the air between them grew heavy. He told the man plainly that his threats meant nothing here, that he was giving them one chance to leave before things became very different. The leader laughed, trying to shake off the unease that crept into his chest, but the laugh died quickly when he saw that the husband wasn't bluffing. His wife appeared at the doorway then, calm as before, her eyes on her husband, and the gang realized in that moment that she had never been afraid because she had known exactly who was coming home. The leader's smirk twitched into a grimace, the gang's laughter fell into silence, and the neighbors whispered behind curtains that maybe this wasn't going to end the way the HOA wanted. The husband did not shout, did not push, did not threaten with wild words. He only stood his ground with a quiet authority that filled the street stronger than engines or fists, and the bikers felt it pressing against them like an invisible wall. Something about him made it clear. This was not the kind of man you corner, not the kind of man you scare. This was the kind of man who let you dig your own grave before deciding how deep you would go. The gang shuffled uneasily, glancing between each other, waiting for the leader to decide what came next. But the leader himself struggled to find the strength to speak. The husband's silence was louder than their engines, and for the first time since they had arrived, the bikers knew they might have chosen the wrong house. The leader of the bikers tried to stand tall, his voice louder now to cover the unease crawling under his skin, but his words carried less weight with each passing second, and as he shouted about how the HOA controlled this street, about how rules had power, the husband's steady gaze cut through the noise like a knife. He didn't argue, he didn't even move, but his silence was enough to make the gang restless. One of the younger bikers looked at his boots instead of the man in front of him, while another shifted his grip on the handlebars of his bike, suddenly aware of how fragile their confidence was. The wife stood at the doorway, calm and still, and she knew what they didn't. Her husband's past wasn't something these men could understand. To the neighbors watching through their curtains, it looked like an ordinary man facing a group of dangerous bikers, but the truth was far from ordinary. The husband had lived through darker roads than these men could imagine, roads where gangs like this one were nothing but shadows swallowed by bigger storms. In his youth, before settling in this quiet neighborhood, he had walked among men who carried real power. He had trained where fear was tested and broken. He had stood in places where only strength and sharpness kept you alive. He never spoke of it to his neighbors, never boasted about it to anyone. But tonight, with bikers at his door, that past was in his eyes, in the way he stood, in the weight of his voice when he finally spoke. He told the leader that he had seen gangs bigger than theirs fall apart in the blink of an eye, that he had faced men more ruthless than them and watched them beg when the tables turned. His words weren't shouted, weren't dramatic. They were simple truths carried with such certainty that the street felt colder as he spoke them. The bikers looked at each other, unsure now, their bravado slipping like sand through fingers. The leader forced a grin, but the sweat at his temple betrayed him, and his laugh was hollow. He barked at his men to stay focused, but even they could feel something was wrong, something heavy pressing down on them. The neighbors whispered among themselves, their fear mixing with shock, because this wasn't the reaction of a normal man. This wasn't the reaction of someone cornered. It was the reaction of someone who had seen worse and didn't care about their noise. The wife's eyes softened slightly as she watched her husband, because she knew the men outside had no idea who they were dealing with. No idea that the calm silence they mocked was born from years of facing storms far deadlier than motorcycles and empty threats. The leader tried again, stepping closer, his voice dropping into a growl. But when he looked into the husband's eyes, he faltered. He didn't see fear, he didn't even see anger. He saw history, something dark and deep, something that told him this man wasn't bluffing, wasn't pretending, wasn't someone you could break with noise or fists. The husband didn't need to explain further, because his presence alone was explanation enough. He told them once, with slow and heavy words, that if they stayed, they would regret it in ways they couldn't imagine. The weight of his past sat in that warning, and though the bikers didn't know the details, they felt it. They felt that this man was different, and for the first time since they arrived, true fear flickered in their eyes. The street was heavy with silence when the husband finally moved a step closer, his shadow falling across the gang leader's boots, and for the first time the laughter of the bikers seemed to die in their throats as if the night itself was holding its breath. He spoke slowly, each word cutting sharper than a shout ever could, telling them that this was their first and only warning, that if they turned around and left now, they might still keep their pride, but if they stayed even a minute longer, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. His voice was calm, but calm in a way that felt dangerous, the kind of calm that came before a storm no one could stop. The leader tried to sneer, to laugh it off, but the edges of his confidence were cracking and his men could see it. One of the bikers muttered nervously under his breath that maybe this wasn't worth it, but the leader barked at him, desperate to hold control, insisting that they were the ones with power here, that the HOA was behind them, that no one could touch them. Yet his eyes flickered, betraying the unease he tried to hide. The neighbors leaned closer to their windows, whispering about the husband's words, about how they didn't sound like empty threats, about how the man spoke as if he already knew exactly what would happen next. The wife stood silently at the doorway, her calm face like stone, her eyes fixed on her husband with a trust that unnerved the gang even more. She knew he wasn't bluffing, and that certainty in her gaze spread like a disease through the bikers, who suddenly felt smaller than they had minutes ago. The leader raised his voice louder, trying to drown out the silence, shouting that they weren't afraid, that they could come back any time, that the HOA owned this neighborhood, but the words rang hollow in the dark. The husband didn't move, didn't shout back, only let the silence stretch again before repeating in the same heavy tone that this was their one and only warning, and that the clock was already running out. As if on cue, faint lights appeared at the end of the street, headlights gliding slowly closer, multiple beams cutting through the night. The bikers turned to look, their nerves tightening when they saw not just cars, but dark SUVs, their engines quiet but heavy, rolling like predators into the neighborhood. The leader's smirk faltered, his throat tightening as he forced another laugh, saying it must just be neighbors returning home, but his men weren't convinced. Something about those vehicles, about the way they moved in perfect formation, about the timing, made it clear this wasn't chance. The husband didn't even look behind him at the lights. He only kept his eyes on the leader, calm and unshaken, as though he had known they were coming all along. The neighbors gasped quietly, some pulling children away from the windows, others unable to look away as the black SUVs rolled closer and closer, their polished frames reflecting the streetlights like cold steel. The gang began shifting uneasily, their boots scraping the pavement, their hands tightening on handlebars, their confidence unraveling with every passing second. They had come to intimidate, to scare, to send a message, but now they were the ones being cornered, trapped between the silence of the husband and the slow, deliberate arrival of something far bigger than themselves. The leader swallowed hard, sweat trickling down his brow despite the cool night air, and in that moment he understood that the man before him hadn't been bluffing, hadn't been afraid, hadn't been powerless. The warning wasn't just words, it was a promise, and the time to escape it was running out fast. The roar of the motorcycles felt weaker now as the black SUVs came to a stop one by one along the street, their engines quiet but powerful, the kind of engines that didn't need noise to show strength. Doors opened with sharp clicks and heavy boots stepped onto the pavement, and the bikers who had arrived with arrogance and laughter suddenly felt their stomachs twist. These were not neighbors, not bystanders, not random visitors. The men stepping out were tall, broad, dressed in dark uniforms with emblems stitched on their sleeves, their eyes hidden behind tinted glasses even in the dim streetlight, their movements sharp and disciplined like soldiers who had done this many times before. The neighbors gasped from behind their curtains, covering their mouths, because this was nothing like the usual HOA drama they had seen. This was something darker, something dangerous, something that told them the husband wasn't just an ordinary man. The husband didn't even turn his head, didn't need to look at the men who had arrived. He just stood with his arms crossed, his gaze locked on the gang leader, while the presence of the new arrivals filled the street like a silent storm. The gang leader's throat went dry as he tried to laugh, tried to pretend this didn't matter, but his men were already shifting nervously, their hands twitching on handlebars, their tough faces cracking with unease. One of them whispered that they should leave, but the leader hissed at him to stay, though his own voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear crawling inside him. The men from the SUVs spread out slowly, their boots heavy against the pavement, their faces unreadable, and they didn't say a word. They didn't have to. Their silence was enough to crush the false bravado of the bikers. The neighbors felt the change too, felt the tension tilt as the hunters became the hunted, as the bikers who had come to intimidate now looked like cornered dogs surrounded by wolves. The wife stood at the doorway, her eyes calm as always, but this time there was the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of her lips, because she knew the tables had turned completely. The husband finally spoke, his voice low but heavy, telling the gang leader that their fun was over, that they had been given a chance to walk away but had chosen to stay, and now they would face the weight of that choice. The leader tried to bark back, but his words stumbled, his voice cracking under the pressure of so many eyes on him, of the quiet authority that now surrounded the house. One of the bikers dropped his cigarette and stamped it nervously. Another muttered under his breath that this wasn't what they signed up for, that the HOA never told them about this. The leader snapped at him, but it was useless. The cracks were widening. The husband took one step forward, just one. And it was enough to make the gang flinch as though a storm had broken loose. The men from the SUVs moved closer, their formation perfect, their silence suffocating, and the street no longer belonged to the bikers. The neighbors whispered in shock, realizing that the HOA's trick had backfired so badly it might destroy them instead. The bikers who had swaggered in with engines roaring now stood frozen, their strength stripped away, their courage burned to ash under the weight of eyes that didn't fear them. The husband's words echoed again, calm and final, that this was the end of their games, and the gang realized too late that they weren't the ones holding power anymore. They were the ones begging to keep it. The night that had begun with roaring engines and arrogant laughter now stood heavy with silence, broken only by the nervous shuffling of boots and the low hum of the SUVs still idling like watchful beasts. The bikers, who had strutted into the neighborhood with grins and threats, now stood pale and trembling, their tattoos and scars no longer symbols of power but reminders of foolish pride. The husband had not moved much, had not raised his voice, had not even shown anger, yet the weight of his calmness had broken them more completely than fists ever could. The leader, once loud and full of swagger, now struggled to find his voice, his throat dry as he looked at the line of silent men standing behind the husband, men who were trained, disciplined, and dangerous in a way he had never faced before. His smirk was gone, replaced by a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, his eyes darting like a trapped animal searching for escape but finding none. One by one his men began to crack, their bravado spilling away as they muttered apologies under their breath, their voices shaking as they tried to explain they were just following orders, that the HOA had promised them it would be easy, that they didn't mean real harm. The neighbors watched wide-eyed from behind their curtains, unable to believe what they were seeing. The same gang that had arrived like kings of the street now reduced to frightened men. Their hands raised slightly as though surrendering to an invisible power. The wife stepped out now, her expression calm, her eyes locked on them with the same certainty she had shown all evening, and the sight of her made their humiliation deeper, because they realized she had never feared them, not for a second. The leader dropped his tough act at last, his voice breaking as he begged the husband to let them leave, swearing they would never return, swearing they would never work for the HOA again. His men echoed him, their voices desperate, tripping over promises, pleading for mercy. They had come to scare, to intimidate, to dominate, but now they were on the edge of their own collapse. The fear in their eyes so raw that even the neighbors who hated the HOA felt a strange mix of pity and disbelief. The husband stepped forward once more, his presence alone enough to silence their babbling. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He simply told them that they had made their choice when they came to his home, that they had chosen to raise their hands against the wrong family, and that mercy was not something begged for with words but earned with actions. His words cut deeper than any blow, and the bikers nodded frantically, promising anything, agreeing to anything, their earlier arrogance shattered into dust. The leader even bent his head, his voice shaking as he swore they would leave the neighborhood that night, never to return, and the rest of his men followed, their heads bowed like defeated dogs. The neighbors could not believe their eyes. They whispered to each other that they had never seen men like this beg, that they had never seen the HOA's power broken so quickly and so completely. The wife stood by her husband's side, her calmness now revealed as the confidence of someone who knew all along that her family was untouchable. The gang, humiliated and broken, stumbled back to their bikes, their engines coughing to life weakly, no longer roaring with pride but sputtering like beaten animals retreating from a stronger predator. They rode away without looking back, their tails between their legs, and the street that had been filled with noise hours ago was left in heavy silence once more. The SUVs remained still, their presence like a shadow of warning, and the husband turned to his wife, exchanging a look of quiet understanding that said everything without words. The neighbors stayed glued to their windows, too stunned to move, whispering that this was the night the HOA's grip had cracked, that this was the night they realized they lived next to someone the HOA should never have crossed.